The sword fell in silence, and with it, an empire that had lasted 700 years. I stood in the courtyard of Edo Castle on a March morning in 1868, watching the last shogun surrender his authority to a 15-year-old emperor he would never meet. Around me, samurai in full armor wept openly their world ending, not with the clash of steel they had trained for since childhood, but with the scratch of a brush on paper ink characters that dissolve centuries of tradition in a single stroke. The Meiji Restoration, they would call it. The death of the samurai era. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, how warrior kings ruled Japan for nearly a millennium, you must go back to when the sword was first drawn. When the first samurai pledged his life to a lord, he would die to protect. When honor meant more than breath itself. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The word samurai comes from the verb saburao, meaning to serve. But this simple definition masks a complexity that would shape Japanese civilization for centuries. The samurai were not merely soldiers, they were not simply warriors, they were an entire social class, a philosophical system, a way of life built on principles so rigid that death was preferable to their violation. To be samurai was to exist in a state of constant readiness for death, to cultivate a mind so disciplined that fear became impossible, to serve with such absolute loyalty that your own life became meaningless compared to your lord's will. The roots of the samurai stretch back to the Heian period from 794 to 1185, when Japan's imperial court in Kyoto had grown soft and ceremonial, more concerned with poetry and courtly intrigue than with the practical matters of governing a fractious archipelago. The emperors, considered divine descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu, ruled in theory but governed little in practice. Real power lay scattered among provincial lords who controlled vast estates and needed protection from rivals, bandits, and rebellious peasants. These lords began hiring warriors, men skilled with the bow and sword, trained in horsemanship and tactics. At first, these warriors were simply hired muscle, no different from mercenaries anywhere in the world. But something changed in the crucible of Japanese culture. These warriors began to develop a code, an ethos that elevated their profession from mere killing to something approaching spiritual practice. The earliest samurai were primarily archers. The sword, which would later become the soul of the samurai, was initially a secondary weapon. A samurai's primary skill was shooting accurately from horseback, an art that required years of training and extraordinary discipline. The great bows of Japan, taller than a man and asymmetrical in design, could send arrows through armor at remarkable distances. A skilled archer could fire repeatedly while his horse galloped, hitting targets with precision that seemed supernatural to those who witnessed it. These early warriors served the great clans, the Minamoto, the Taira, the Fujiwara, families whose rivalries would drench Japan in blood and ultimately forge the samurai class into the ruling elite. The Genpei War, fought between the Minamoto and Taira clans from 1180 to 1185, marked the true birth of samurai dominance. This conflict was not merely a power struggle between two families, it was a civilizational shift, the moment when military power conclusively trumped aristocratic breeding and imperial divine right. The tales of the Genpei War read like legend because they became legend, passed down through generations, embellished and mythologized until historical figures became archetypal heroes. Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the brilliant tactician who led his clan to victory despite being hunted by his own jealous brother. Taira no Kiyomori, who rose from relatively humble origins to become the most powerful man in Japan, only to see his clan annihilated. Tomo Gozen, the female warrior who fought alongside men and whose skill with bow and blade became the stuff of songs and stories. When Minamoto no Yoritomo emerged victorious from the Genpei War, he did something unprecedented. Rather than seizing the throne or eliminating the emperor, he established a parallel government in Kamakura, far from the imperial court in Kyoto. He took the title of shogun, generalissimo, and created a military government, the Bakufu, that would rule Japan in the emperor's name, while the emperor himself became a ceremonial figurehead, a religious symbol with no actual power. This was the birth of the shogunate system, and with it, the true samurai era began. For the next 7 centuries, with only brief interruptions, Japan would be ruled by warrior governments, by men whose authority came not from divine descent or aristocratic lineage, but from military power and the loyalty of armed retainers who would die at their command. The Kamakura period, from 1185 to 1333, established the fundamental structures of samurai society. The relationship between lord and retainer became formalized, codified, almost sacred. A samurai served his daimyo, his feudal lord, with absolute loyalty. In return, the daimyo provided land, rice stipends, and protection. This bond was not merely contractual, it was spiritual, moral, total. To betray your lord was to betray yourself, to become ronin, a masterless samurai, a man without purpose or identity, existing in a kind of social death that was worse than actual death. The code that governed samurai behavior was not yet called Bushido, the way of the warrior, but its principles were already taking shape. Loyalty above all, honor unto death, courage in the face of any danger. Self-discipline so complete that emotions became controlled, channeled, weaponized, and underlying everything, an acceptance of mortality so profound that life itself became secondary to how one died. This acceptance of death was not nihilistic, it was liberating. A samurai who had already accepted his death, who had mentally prepared for it every single day, could act without hesitation in battle, could make decisions unclouded by fear or self-preservation. The practice of mental preparation for death became formalized in various ways: meditation, visualization, and the famous practice of considering oneself already dead before entering battle. The weapons of the samurai evolved during the Kamakura period. While the bow remained primary, the sword began its ascent to mythological status. Japanese swordsmiths had been producing blades for centuries, but during this period, their craft reached heights that have never been surpassed. The katana, with its distinctive curved blade, its edge so sharp it could cut through bamboo with a whisper, its construction involving hundreds of folded layers of steel, became more than a weapon. It became a spiritual object, the physical manifestation of the samurai's soul. The process of creating a katana was almost ritualistic. The swordsmith would purify himself, pray to the gods, and then spend weeks or months folding and refolding steel, heating and hammering, creating a blade with a hard edge capable of incredible sharpness and a softer spine that provided flexibility and prevented shattering. Each sword was unique, bearing the signature of its maker, and a fine blade could be worth more than an estate. Samurai gave their swords names, treated them as honored companions, and believed that the spirit of the warrior resided in his blade. The Kamakura shogunate faced its greatest test in 1274 and again in 1281, when Kublai Khan, having conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty, turned his attention to Japan. He sent massive invasion fleets, the largest amphibious assaults the world had yet seen, dwarfing anything attempted in the West. The Mongols, who had conquered from Korea to Hungary, who had destroyed armies and empires across Asia and Europe, met the samurai on the beaches of Kyushu. The battles were fierce and revealed both the strengths and limitations of samurai warfare. The Mongols fought in disciplined units using coordinated tactics, explosives, and massed archery. The samurai fought as individuals, each warrior seeking personal glory, announcing his name and lineage before engaging an opponent, treating war as a series of single combats. This individualistic approach, rooted in honor and tradition, was nearly disastrous against the Mongol horde tactics. But the samurai adapted, learned to fight in units, abandoned some of their ceremonial combat practices when facing an enemy that didn't share or respect them. And they were saved twice by divine wind, the kamikaze typhoons that destroyed the Mongol fleets and convinced the Japanese that they were protected by the gods, that their islands were sacred and inviolable. This belief in divine protection would persist for centuries, with catastrophic consequences when it was finally tested again in the 20th century. The Kamakura shogunate fell in 1333, brought down by the usual combination of internal dissension, economic strain, and the ambitions of an emperor who actually wanted to rule rather than merely reign. The Emperor Go-Daigo briefly restored imperial power, but his restoration lasted only 3 years before a new military strongman, Ashikaga Takauji, established a new shogunate in Kyoto. The Ashikaga period, also called the Muromachi period after the district in Kyoto where the shogun's palace stood, lasted from 1336 to 1573. It was a time of cultural flowering and political chaos, of exquisite art and brutal warfare, of Zen Buddhism reaching its peak influence and the country descending into endless civil war. This was the era when many of the arts we associate with Japan reached their mature forms. The tea ceremony, which transformed the simple act of drinking tea into a spiritual practice emphasizing harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. Ikebana, the art of flower arrangement, which saw the placement of branches and blooms as a meditation on impermanence and natural beauty. No theater, with its masked performers and stylized movements, its plays exploring profound philosophical themes through spare, symbolic action. Landscape gardening, especially the rock gardens that used carefully placed stones and raked gravel to represent mountains, rivers, and the fundamental patterns of existence. All of these arts were influenced by Zen Buddhism, which had been imported from China but found its fullest expression in Japan. Zen emphasized direct experience over scriptural learning, sudden enlightenment over gradual accumulation of merit, and a kind of alert spontaneity that meshed perfectly with the samurai ethos. A swordsman trained in Zen didn't think about his technique. Thinking was too slow. He acted from a state of mushin, no mind, where the sword moved by itself, where the practitioner and the action became one. Many samurai became serious Zen practitioners, spending hours in meditation, studying koans, paradoxical questions designed to short-circuit logical thinking and induce enlightenment, and seeking to apply meditative awareness to combat. The greatest swordsmen wrote treatises that were as much spiritual texts as martial manuals, exploring the connection between swordsmanship and enlightenment, between facing death in battle and facing the ego in meditation. But while culture flourished, political stability collapsed. The Ashikaga shoguns were weak, unable to control their most powerful vassals. The country fragmented into dozens of independent domains, each ruled by a daimyo with his own army of samurai. These warlords fought constantly, forming and breaking alliances, conquering and being conquered, in a period known as Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States, that lasted from roughly 1467 to 1615. This was the era of the samurai at their most purely martial, when combat was not ceremonial but constant, when tactical innovation and strategic brilliance mattered more than aristocratic lineage, when commoners could rise to become daimyos through military skill and ruthless ambition. The romantic image of the samurai that persists in popular culture, the lone warrior wandering a war-torn landscape, selling his sword to the highest bidder or seeking to right wrongs, comes largely from this period and is not entirely mythological. Masterless samurai Ronin did wander the countryside, as did warrior monks from militant Buddhist temples, bandits, ninja, and all manner of dangerous men. Warfare changed during the Sengoku period. Armies grew larger, often including not just samurai but ashiguru, foot soldiers of peasant origin armed with spears and increasingly with firearms. The introduction of Portuguese arquebuses in 1543 revolutionized Japanese warfare. Within decades, Japan was producing more firearms than any European nation, and daimyos who could afford large numbers of guns gained tremendous advantages. The old samurai way of individual combat became obsolete on battlefields where thousands of soldiers maneuvered in formation and volleys of gunfire decided engagements before swords were even drawn. Yet the samurai adapted. They integrated firearms into their armies while maintaining their identity as elite warriors, as officers and cavalry, as the core around which armies were organized. The bow and sword remained symbols of samurai status, even as practical warfare made them secondary to guns and pikes. 3 men emerged from the chaos of the Sengoku period to reunify Japan, and their personalities and methods reveal much about the samurai character. Oda Nobunaga was a tactical genius and ruthless pragmatist who used firearms extensively, destroyed Buddhist monasteries that opposed him, and recognized no restraint except effectiveness. He nearly unified the country before being betrayed and forced to commit suicide by one of his own generals in 1582. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's successor, rose from peasant origins to become the most powerful man in Japan through sheer ability, a trajectory only possible during the fluid social conditions of the Sengoku period. He completed much of the unification, invaded Korea twice in failed attempts to conquer China, and tried to codify the social order by forbidding anyone but samurai from carrying weapons, a policy that would have long-lasting effects on Japanese society. And finally, Tokugawa Ieyasu, patient and calculating, who waited until Hideyoshi died and then defeated his rivals at the decisive Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. Ieyasu established the Tokugawa shogunate, which would rule Japan until 1868, and he did something remarkable. He ended the warfare. After more than a century of constant conflict, he imposed peace, not through reconciliation but through such overwhelming force and careful political arrangement that rebellion became impossible. The Tokugawa period, also called the Edo period after the shogun's capital, represents a paradox in samurai history. This was the era when samurai culture reached its most refined and elaborate form, when Bushido was fully articulated as a philosophy, when samurai aesthetics dominated society, when being samurai meant adhering to incredibly detailed codes of dress behavior and etiquette. And yet this was also the era when samurai had almost nothing to do. Peace is terrible for warriors. The Tokugawa shoguns created a system designed to prevent war. Daimyos were required to spend alternate years in Edo, leaving family members as hostages when they returned to their domains. Castles were limited in number and size. Marriage between daimyo families required shogunal approval. An elaborate spy network watched for any signs of rebellion. And crucially, Japan was closed to the outside world. Christianity was banned and persecuted brutally after early missionary success. Foreign trade was limited to a single Dutch trading post in Nagasaki. Japanese were forbidden to leave the country or build ocean-going ships. This isolation, this enforced peace, lasted for more than 250 years. Entire generations of samurai were born, lived, and died without ever experiencing battle. They trained constantly with sword and bow, practiced martial arts, studied strategy and tactics, but they fought no one except each other in carefully controlled training exercises. They were warriors without a war, maintaining a military readiness for conflicts that never came. How did they occupy themselves? They became bureaucrats, administrators managing the domains and cities under daimyo control. They became scholars producing texts on ethics, history, and philosophy. They became artists, practitioners of tea ceremony and flower arrangement and calligraphy. The martial arts became increasingly formalized, codified into specific schools and styles: kenjutsu for swordsmanship, kyujutsu for archery, jujutsu for unarmed combat, each with its own lineage of masters and techniques. This was when Bushido, the way of the warrior, was fully articulated as a philosophical system. The most famous text on Bushido, Hagakure, was written during this period by Yamamoto Tsunetomo, a samurai who had served the Nabeshima clan. Hagakure is often summarized in a single shocking sentence: "The way of the samurai is found in death." But the full text is more complex, more nuanced, exploring what it means to live as a warrior in peacetime, how to maintain martial spirit without martial conflict, how to find meaning in service when there are no battles to fight. Tsunetomo argued that a samurai should meditate on death every morning, should imagine all the ways he might die that day, cut down in combat, struck by falling timber, drowning, succumbing to disease, so that death became familiar, accepted, robbed of its power to frighten. Only then could a samurai act with perfect freedom, unencumbered by fear or attachment. This sounds morbid to modern ears, but it was meant as a path to liberation, a way to live fully by accepting mortality completely. The samurai maintained their position at the top of the social hierarchy, even in peacetime. Below them were farmers, who produced the rice that funded everything. Below farmers were artisans and craftsmen. At the bottom were merchants, who produced nothing but merely moved goods from place to place, accumulating wealth without creating value, at least according to Confucian philosophy, which heavily influenced Tokugawa society. In practice, this hierarchy became increasingly fictional. Merchants grew rich while many samurai became poor, struggling to maintain the appearance of their status on fixed rice stipends that didn't increase even as prices rose. Samurai borrowed from merchants, went into debt to merchants, and sometimes even sold their samurai status to wealthy merchants seeking social elevation. The system was ossifying, becoming brittle, maintaining forms that no longer matched reality. The samurai themselves became divided. The upper samurai, those from prestigious families serving directly under daimyos, lived comfortable lives in castle towns, their positions secure by birth. The lower samurai, less prestigiously connected, often struggled, and beneath them were the ronin, masterless samurai who had lost their positions through death or dissolution of their lord's domain, wandering without purpose, sometimes turning to crime, sometimes finding work as instructors or bodyguards, often living in poverty while maintaining the dignity and restrictions of samurai status. This was also the period when the enforcement of samurai privilege became most brutal and arbitrary. A practice called kirisute gomen, permission to cut and leave, allowed samurai to kill commoners who showed them disrespect, with virtually no legal consequences. A peasant who failed to bow properly, a merchant who spoke too boldly, anyone who insulted a samurai's honor could be cut down on the spot. The samurai needing only to report the incident to authorities, who would invariably rule the killing justified. This practice, more than perhaps anything else, reveals the dark side of samurai culture. A militarized elite maintaining their privileges through the implicit and explicit threat of violence, a warrior class that had become parasitic on a society that no longer needed them for protection but couldn't dislodge them from power. Yet samurai culture also produced remarkable things during the Edo period. The martial arts were refined to extraordinary levels of sophistication. The sword, which had become more ceremonial than practical, was perfected as an art form, not just in its making but in its use. Great swordsmen like Miyamoto Musashi, who lived during the transition from Sengoku warfare to Tokugawa peace, developed schools of technique that were as much philosophy as combat method. Musashi's Book of Five Rings, written near the end of his life, is still studied today, not just by martial artists but by business people, strategists, and anyone seeking insight into competition and conflict. Musashi argued for a pragmatic, adaptive approach to combat. Use two swords or one or none. Fight in any condition, any terrain. Develop a mind so flexible that it could respond instantly to any situation without being locked into predetermined patterns. His philosophy was deeply influenced by Zen but also by his experience in more than 60 duels, all of which he won. The aesthetic principles refined during the Edo period, simplicity, asymmetry, suggestion rather than statement, finding beauty in imperfection and impermanence, came partially from samurai culture and its Zen influences. The concept of wabi-sabi, appreciating the beauty of things that are imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete, resonates with the samurai acceptance of mortality and transience. A tea bowl with a crack, deliberately repaired with gold to highlight rather than hide the damage, becomes more beautiful for its history, its survival, its acknowledgement that nothing lasts. But while Japan isolated itself and samurai culture became increasingly refined and divorced from military reality, the world was changing. European powers were expanding, colonizing, bringing industrial technology and modern warfare to every corner of the globe. The samurai sword, however perfectly crafted, was no match for modern artillery. The samurai code, however noble in theory, couldn't defend against steamships and rifled cannon. The crisis came in 1853, when American Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay with a squadron of modern warships and demanded that Japan open itself to trade. The Tokugawa shogunate, confronted with overwhelming military superiority, had no choice but to agree. The resulting treaties were humiliating, granting foreigners special privileges and demonstrating to everyone in Japan that the shogunate could not defend the country, that the entire system was built on foundations that had eroded. Many samurai, especially younger ones from domains that had always resented Tokugawa dominance, saw opportunity in crisis. If the shogunate was weak, if it couldn't protect Japan from foreign encroachment, then perhaps it was time for change, time to restore power to the emperor and modernize the country to resist colonization. These were not democratic reformers. They were samurai who wanted to preserve Japanese independence and, not coincidentally, their own elite status. The next 15 years saw a complex political struggle as different factions maneuvered for advantage. Some domains, particularly Satsuma and Choshu in southern Japan, began modernizing their militaries, buying Western weapons, learning Western tactics. The shogunate tried to reform as well, but it was hampered by tradition, by the vested interests of those who benefited from the existing system, by its own foundational conservatism. The conflict came to a head in the Boshin War, fought from 1868 to 1869, a civil war between forces loyal to the shogunate and those supporting imperial restoration. It was a strange war, mixing traditional samurai combat with modern weaponry, with battles decided by artillery and rifle fire, but also by swordsmen charging in armor, by warrior codes clashing with military pragmatism. The imperial forces won, not because they were more traditionally samurai, but because they were less so. They used conscript armies, peasant soldiers with modern rifles, tactics learned from Western military advisors. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, surrendered without fighting to the end, recognizing that continued resistance would only bring more destruction. And with that surrender, the system that had ruled Japan for 7 centuries ended. The new Meiji government, ruling in the emperor's name but controlled by samurai from the victorious domains, faced a problem. How do you modernize without losing what makes you distinctively Japanese? How do you adopt Western technology and institutions while preserving cultural identity? And most pressingly for our story, what do you do with the samurai? The Meiji reforms, implemented rapidly over the 1870s, systematically dismantled samurai privilege. First, the stipends that had supported samurai families for generations were converted to bonds, a one-time payment that many samurai squandered, having no experience with financial management. Then the distinction between samurai and commoners was legally abolished. Anyone could have a surname, wear what they wanted, marry whom they chose, pursue any occupation. Most devastatingly, the right to wear swords in public was abolished in 1876. The katana, the soul of the samurai, became a relic, something to hang on a wall or store in a closet. A conscript army was created, with universal male conscription, where peasants and merchants served alongside former samurai, all treated equally, all wearing the same uniform. The samurai, as a distinct military class, ceased to exist. Many samurai accepted these changes, recognizing them as necessary for Japan's survival in a hostile world. They became officers in the new army, bureaucrats in the modernizing government, businessmen in the emerging industrial economy, teachers spreading education to a newly literate populace. The samurai virtues, discipline, loyalty, service, were redirected into nation-building rather than clan warfare, but some could not accept the change. In 1877, Saigo Takamori, one of the heroes of the Meiji Restoration, led a rebellion of disaffected samurai in Satsuma. These warriors, many wearing traditional armor and wielding swords, faced a conscript army equipped with modern rifles, artillery, and Gatling guns. The result was inevitable. The samurai charged bravely, died honorably, and were destroyed utterly. Saigo himself committed seppuku after his final defeat. The last great samurai, choosing to die according to the old code, rather than live in the new world. The destruction of the samurai rebellion at the Battle of Shiroyama in 1877 marked the definitive end of the samurai as a military force. But it didn't mark the end of samurai influence on Japanese culture and society. In fact, the mythology of the samurai, freed from the complicated reality of the actual warrior class, began to grow. As Japan industrialized with breathtaking speed, as cities grew and factories multiplied, as traditional ways of life were disrupted and discarded, there was nostalgia for a past that seemed simpler, more honorable, more meaningful. The samurai became symbols of that lost world, paragons of loyalty, honor, and discipline, warriors who embodied virtues that seemed threatened by modernity. The reality of samurai as often impoverished, sometimes cruel, occasionally corrupt bureaucrats was forgotten or ignored in favor of an idealized image. This idealized samurai mythology was deliberately cultivated by the Meiji government and its successors. As Japan built a modern military, it wanted soldiers who would fight with samurai spirit, absolute loyalty, fearlessness of death, willingness to sacrifice everything for emperor and nation. The Bushido Code was taught to conscripts as the essence of Japanese military virtue, even though most of these soldiers came from families that had been beneath samurai in the old hierarchy. This reimagined Bushido became more rigid, more fanatical than anything from the Edo period. The selective readings of texts like Hagakure emphasized death before dishonor, suicide rather than surrender, fighting to the last man rather than accepting defeat. The nuances and complexities of actual samurai philosophy were stripped away, leaving only the most extreme elements. This militarized nationalistic Bushido would have catastrophic consequences in the 20th century. The Japanese soldiers who fought in China, who attacked Pearl Harbor, who defended Pacific Islands to the death rather than surrender, who became kamikaze pilots crashing their planes into American ships. They were not samurai, but they had been taught to believe they were heirs to samurai spirit, and they acted accordingly. The end of World War II brought another reckoning with samurai mythology. Japan, utterly defeated, occupied by foreign forces for the first time in its history, had to confront how Bushido had been perverted into a suicide cult, how samurai ideals had been weaponized to justify atrocities and drive young men to pointless deaths. The post-war period saw a complicated relationship with the samurai legacy, rejection of its militarism, but also continued fascination with its aesthetics and philosophy. In popular culture, samurai became and remain endlessly fascinating. Films by Akira Kurosawa brought samurai stories to global audiences, showing warriors who were neither purely heroic nor simply violent, but complex humans navigating impossible moral situations. Novels, manga, anime, and video games have continued to explore samurai themes, each generation finding new meanings in old stories. The martial arts that samurai practiced, kendo, kyudo, iaido, judo, aikido, survived and spread globally, practiced today by millions who will never fight a real duel or serve a feudal lord, but who find value in the discipline, the physical culture, the meditative aspects of these practices. The martial arts became ways of personal development, of cultivating mind and body together, divorced from their original context of preparing for lethal combat. The philosophical elements of Bushido, the emphasis on discipline, on self-cultivation, on living in awareness of mortality, on serving something larger than yourself, continue to influence how many Japanese people think about work, about duty, about proper behavior. The salaryman who devotes himself utterly to his company, working brutal hours and socializing with colleagues rather than family, is often compared to a samurai serving his lord. And while this comparison is problematic in many ways, it reveals how deeply samurai ideals have been woven into modern Japanese culture. But what should we, looking back across centuries, make of the samurai? Were they noble warriors living by an admirable code? Or were they a privileged class maintaining power through violence and the threat of violence? The answer, of course, is both, and neither, and more complicated than any simple judgment allows. The samurai were products of their time, shaped by the specific historical circumstances of feudal Japan. Some were cruel and arrogant, some were thoughtful and principled. Most were probably just trying to fulfill their roles, to meet the expectations placed upon them by their culture and their class. The same could be said of knights in medieval Europe, of warrior elites in any society. What makes the samurai particularly fascinating is how consciously they articulated their warrior ethos, how deliberately they transformed violence into a philosophical system. A European knight fought for God, for glory, for land and plunder. A samurai fought for his lord, but he also fought to perfect himself, to achieve a state of mind where death held no terror, and thus action became pure, unclouded by fear or desire. The sword arts, practiced to their highest levels, became a kind of moving meditation, a way of training the mind through training the body. The way a master swordsman could cut through a bamboo stalk with seemingly no effort, the blade moving too fast to see, was not just physical technique but the result of mental cultivation, of achieving a state where the conscious mind didn't interfere with the body's trained responses. This integration of physical practice and mental cultivation, of martial arts and meditation, of the way of the warrior and the way of enlightenment, represents one of the samurai era's most significant contributions to human culture. The idea that disciplined physical practice can lead to mental and spiritual development, that there is no separation between training the body and cultivating the mind, has influenced martial arts worldwide and extends beyond martial arts into athletics, performing arts, and contemplative practices generally. The tea ceremony, which seems so far from warfare, was adopted by samurai precisely because it cultivated the same qualities needed for combat: complete attention to the present moment, graceful economy of movement, a mind calm and clear, regardless of circumstances. The warrior and the tea master were training the same underlying capacities, just in different contexts. The aesthetic principles developed in samurai culture, simplicity, restraint, finding beauty in impermanence and imperfection, offer an alternative to the accumulation and excess that characterize much of modern consumer society. The idea that a single perfect object, contemplated deeply, can be more valuable than 1,000 possessions casually acquired runs counter to contemporary materialism, but offers a path to a different kind of richness. The emphasis on loyalty and service, stripped of its feudal context, can be understood as commitment to something larger than individual self-interest. The samurai served his lord, but the underlying principle was subordinating personal desires to a greater purpose. In a modern democratic context, this might translate to commitment to community, to principles, to causes worthy of dedication and sacrifice. The acceptance of mortality, the practice of contemplating death to free oneself from fear, offers a response to one of the fundamental human problems, our terror of our own impermanence. The samurai approach was not to deny death or pretend it isn't coming, but to face it so completely that it loses its power to paralyze us, allowing us to act with clarity and purpose in the time we have. But we must also remember that these principles existed within a social system that was fundamentally unjust. Samurai could kill commoners almost at whim. Women were subordinated within rigid gender hierarchies. The entire system was built on hereditary privilege, where your birth determined your possibilities regardless of your abilities or character. The peace of the Tokugawa era was maintained through surveillance, repression, and the credible threat of violence against anyone who challenged the system. The samurai mythology also contributed to some of 20th century Japan's greatest tragedies. The belief that death was preferable to surrender, that fighting to the last man represented the highest virtue, led to countless pointless deaths, Japanese soldiers holding hopeless positions rather than retreating, civilians on Saipan and Okinawa committing suicide rather than face American occupation, teenagers being sent on kamikaze missions because dying for the emperor was supposedly the ultimate honor. Post-war Japan has had to reckon with this legacy, separating the admirable elements of samurai culture from the destructive ones, preserving traditions while acknowledging their limitations and dangers. This work is ongoing, complicated, and probably never fully complete. Today, actual samurai are long gone, dead for more than a century, but their cultural legacy persists, transformed and reinterpreted by each new generation. The martial arts they practiced are now global phenomena. The swords they carried are art objects displayed in museums and studied by scholars. The films and stories about them are watched by people who have never been to Japan and couldn't point to Edo on a map. The samurai have become universal symbols, representing different things to different people. For some, they represent honor and discipline, a counterpoint to modern society's perceived lack of both. For others, they represent the romance of the warrior, the idea that there was once a time when battle was governed by codes, when warriors fought with skill and courage, rather than simply pulling triggers from a distance. For still others, they represent an example of how a professional military class can shape an entire civilization, for better and worse. Perhaps the most important legacy of the samurai era is the demonstration that warrior culture need not be merely about violence. The samurai at their best tried to transform violence into something meaningful, to create beauty and philosophy and spiritual practice out of the brutal necessity of fighting and killing. They succeeded imperfectly, inconsistently, but the attempt itself is significant. In our own age, when warfare is conducted with drones and missiles, when soldiers kill enemies, they never see when entire populations can be destroyed with weapons that would seem like magic to any samurai. Perhaps there is something to learn from a warrior culture that insisted on looking death in the face, that demanded courage and skill rather than simply technological superiority that tried, however imperfectly, to bind violence with honor and death with meaning. The sword that fell in silence in 1868, ending an era, has never truly been sheathed. It hangs in our imagination, in our martial arts schools, in our movies and stories and games, still sharp after all these centuries, still capable of cutting through to fundamental questions about courage, loyalty, mortality, and what it means to live with purpose in a world where everything is temporary and death comes for us all. The samurai are gone, but the way of the warrior continues, transformed, adapted, reinterpreted for new ages and new challenges, whether that continuation honors or betrays the original samurai, whether it keeps faith with their best principles or merely perpetuates their worst excesses, is a question each generation must answer. What we can say with certainty is that for 700 years, warrior kings ruled Japan, and in doing so they created a culture rich and complex enough that we are still, centuries later, trying to understand what they achieved and what they left behind.